The radio crackled like a dying fire. Private first class. Tommy Hale leaned closer to it, the glow of the dial painting his knuckles a dull amber as the ship rolled beneath him. The Atlantic was black tonight, endless and heaving, the kind of dark that swallowed thoughts whole. Somewhere beyond the steel walls of the troop transport, waves slapped against the hull like impatient hands. Inside, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear that no one wanted to name. The voice on the radio wasn't American. It was sharp, measured, confident, German. "The Führer speaks not only to Germany," the English-language broadcast said, calm as a preacher at a pulpit. "He speaks to the world, and tonight he speaks to you." A few men laughed nervously. Someone muttered, "Turn that crap off." But no one did. Tommy swallowed. He was 22, from a wheat town outside Salina, Kansas, where the loudest thing at night used to be cicadas and the freight trains rolling east. Now he was packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers wearing the same uniform, all of them listening despite themselves, as Hitler's propagandists reached across the ocean, threading words like barbed wire into the minds of men headed for war. "You American boys," the voice continued, smooth as smoke, "sent to die for politicians who will never know your names. Your mothers will receive letters. Your graves will be unmarked." Corporal Eddie Ramirez spat onto the deck. "Son of a bitch," he said. "He talks like he knows us." "That's the point," said Staff Sergeant William Mercer from the shadows. Mercer was older, mid-30s, with a face that looked carved from old wood. He'd fought in North Africa, seen things. They want inside your head before you ever see a German helmet. The ship creaked. Somewhere, a man started praying under his breath. Tommy shut his eyes, but the words stuck. He thought of his mother, Clara Hale, standing at the kitchen sink with the radio on low, hearing President Roosevelt's voice months earlier, a date which will live in infamy. He remembered how the room had gone still, like the world itself had taken a breath and never quite let it out. Now another voice crossed the ocean, promising death with absolute certainty. Mercer reached over and snapped the radio off. The silence that followed was worse. "Listen up," Mercer said, voice steady. "They're good at this. Been doing it for years. They don't just fight with bullets. They fight with lies. Don't give 'em room." Tommy nodded, though his chest felt tight. He wondered how many Germans believed just as fiercely in what they'd been told. How many boys his age were listening to another radio somewhere, hearing that America was weak, divided, soft. The engines roared louder as if to drown out the thought. Across the ocean, in a narrow brick house outside Dayton, Ohio, Clara Hale folded laundry and listened to her own radio. The announcer's voice trembled as he described Nazi rallies, hundreds of thousands moving as one body, banners like blood-red waves, Hitler at the podium with his arm raised, eyes burning with something that scared her more than shouting ever could. "They say he's got the whole country hypnotized," the announcer said. "A machine built on fear, pride, and lies." Clara pressed a shirt flat with shaking hands. Tommy's shirt. She'd kept it when he left for basic, the scent of home still clinging to the cotton. She imagined her son hearing those same words twisted, sharpened, aimed straight at his heart. She turned the radio off. France, spring, 1944. Lieutenant James Carter stared at the wall map inside the canvas command tent, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Pins dotted the coastline like a rash, German strongpoints, artillery placements, bunkers poured thick with concrete and ideology. The Nazis hadn't just built defenses, they'd built a story, that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, that the Reich was eternal, that resistance was futile. Carter exhaled smoke. "They've convinced half of Europe we can't break through," he said. Captain Howard Bennett adjusted his helmet. Doesn't matter what they believe, Bennett replied. Matters what our boys believe when the ramps drop. Outside, a loudspeaker blared German music across the fields. Another psychological trick. Leaflets had been found in nearby villages, printed in perfect French and broken English. Go home. You cannot win. Germany is destiny. They're scared, Carter said finally. Bennett raised an eyebrow. People who shout that loud usually are. The first time Tommy Hale saw Nazi propaganda up close, it was plastered to the wall of a bombed-out French schoolhouse. A poster showed Hitler larger than life, eyes lifted toward some imagined future. German soldiers standing proud beneath him like steel statues. Tommy stared at it, while rain dripped through the shattered roof. "What do you see?" Eddie Ramirez asked, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just a little. Tommy thought for a moment. A man who needs everyone to believe he's bigger than he is. Ramirez nodded. Good answer. That night, artillery thundered in the distance, and the sky flashed white like a photographer's bulb. The men huddled in foxholes, listening to another broadcast crackle through captured radios left behind by retreating German units. Berlin says the Americans are afraid, the voice sneered. Berlin says you will break. Tommy clenched his rifle. Around him, men shifted, cursed, stared into the dark. Words, he realized, could wound before bullets ever flew. Mercer crawled over beside him. You still with us, Kansas? Tommy nodded. Yeah. Good, Mercer said, because tomorrow we prove 'em wrong. The guns boomed closer now. The ground shook. Somewhere ahead, beyond the hedgerows and the lies and the fear, waited a war that would decide not just land, but truth itself. Tommy stared into the night, heart hammering, knowing that when dawn came, the propaganda would end, and the real test would begin. Dawn didn't arrive gently. It came in a roar of engines, a concussion of artillery, and the sound of men shouting prayers they didn't remember learning. Tommy Hale felt the landing craft shudder beneath his boots as it slammed through the surf. The ramp was still up, trapping them in a steel box thick with diesel fumes and fear. Water leaked in around the edges, sloshing cold against their ankles. Someone vomited. Someone else laughed too loud, the sound sharp and wrong. 5 seconds! A Navy coxswain yelled. Tommy tightened his grip on his rifle until his fingers ached. Across from him, Eddie Ramirez mouthed something, maybe a Hail Mary, maybe his kid sister's name. Staff Sergeant Mercer stood steady near the ramp, face hard, eyes calm like this was just another bad day on the job. Then the ramp dropped. The world exploded. Machine gun fire tore into the surf, stitching the water with white splashes. Men fell before they took 2 steps, bodies jerking like marionettes with their strings cut. Tommy ran, because the man behind him ran, because stopping meant dying. The beach was chaos, smoke screaming, metal screaming louder. Move! Move! Mercer bellowed. Tommy hit the sand hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. He crawled, dragged himself forward, sand grinding into his mouth, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't tell if the noise was inside his head or tearing the air apart. Above the beach, loudspeakers crackled. English! You! See! The voice mocked. We told you. This is your fate. Tommy felt a surge of rage cut through the fear. He raised his rifle and fired toward the bluffs, not aiming at anything he could see, just shooting back at the lie. They pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. Engineers blew gaps in wire. Medics crawled through fire to reach screaming men. The sand turned dark and slick. When they finally reached the base of the bluff, Tommy's legs were shaking so badly he wasn't sure they'd carry him anymore. They took the first German position just after noon. Inside the bunker, propaganda leaflets were stacked neatly beside ammunition crates. America is controlled by Jews and capitalists. Your commanders don't care if you live. Germany will endure. Eddie kicked one of the stacks over. All this paper, he said hoarsely, and they still couldn't stop us. Tommy sank against the wall, breathing hard. He thought of the voice on the radio, the certainty with which it promised failure. Outside, American soldiers moved up the slope, alive, bleeding, cursing, but moving. That certainty cracked. The hedgerows were worse. By the time they pushed inland, the war had changed shape. No more open beach, no clear lines, just green walls of earth and roots, each one hiding a rifle, a mine, or a man who believed utterly in what he'd been told. German prisoners were taken, some defiant, others hollow-eyed and shaking. One couldn't have been older than 18. He stared at Tommy's uniform like it was something from another planet. "They said you would surrender," the boy whispered in broken English. "They said you were weak." Tommy didn't know what to say. He handed the kid a cigarette. The boy took it like a lifeline. At night, the broadcasts returned. Captured radios crackled to life in farmhouses and barns. Hitler's voice this time, recorded, but electric. It poured out fury and promise, painting Germany as a fortress under siege, every man a hero, every death a sacrifice for eternity. Some of the guys listened despite themselves. "You hear that?" a replacement named Foster said one night, eyes reflecting the lantern light. "He really believes it." "Belief doesn't make it true," Mercer said, cleaning his rifle. "It just makes it louder." But the words crept in anyway, in the quiet moments, in the long watches before dawn. Doubt slid between men like a blade. They lost Eddie Ramirez near St. Lo. A mortar round. No warning. Just a sound like the sky ripping open. When the smoke cleared, Eddie was gone. Where he'd been standing, there was only a crater and pieces of gear scattered like discarded toys. Tommy stood frozen, ears ringing, staring at the empty space. "He was just here," Tommy said, voice breaking. "He was just—" Mercer grabbed him by the collar and pulled him down as machine gun fire ripped overhead. "Get down, goddammit!" Later, when it was quiet, they found Eddie's dog tags half buried in the mud. That night, no one turned the radio on. Back home, Clara Hale sat at the kitchen table, staring at a newspaper photo of liberated French villagers cheering American troops. The headline spoke of progress, of momentum, of inevitable victory. Beneath it, a smaller article mentioned German broadcasts claiming the Allies were being annihilated. She folded the paper carefully. At church the next morning, the pastor spoke about truth and endurance. Clara prayed for her son, but also for the strength to believe what she could not see. In France, Lieutenant Carter faced a different kind of battle. French resistance fighters crowded into the cellar of a ruined cafe, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion. One of them, a woman named Elise, slammed a German leaflet onto the table. "They tell our people you will abandon us," she said. "They say the Reich will punish anyone who helps you." Carter met her gaze. "They're wrong." "They've been wrong before," Elise shot back, "and still people believed." Carter spread out his maps. "Then we give them something stronger than words." That night, Allied planes roared overhead, dropping not bombs, but messages. Leaflets printed in German and French, showing real photos of captured Nazi officers, real statistics, real cracks in the myth. The propaganda war had found its answer. But, on the ground, the cost kept climbing. Tommy sat alone after patrol, Eddie's dog tags wrapped around his fingers. The night insects buzzed. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled, German, defiant to the last syllable. Tommy whispered into the dark, "You're wrong." He didn't know yet how high the price would be to prove it. The sky over Normandy burned the color of rusted steel the morning everything broke open. Tommy Hale crouched in a ditch, slick with rainwater and blood, his helmet low, his heart hammering like it wanted out of his chest. The hedgerow in front of him was alive with sound, rifle cracks, shouts in German, the ugly thump of mortars being walked closer. The earth jumped with every impact, spraying dirt into his mouth, his eyes. "Stay down," Mercer shouted from somewhere to Tommy's left. "They're zeroing in." This wasn't a skirmish. This was a trap. Intelligence had said the road ahead was lightly defended. Intelligence had been wrong. A full German battalion was dug in around the crossroads, their positions camouflaged, their fields of fire perfect, and above it all, mounted on a truck behind the lines, loudspeakers blared. "You are surrounded," the voice declared in flawless English. "Your officers have led you into slaughter. Lay down your weapons. Live." The words hit harder than the shells. A replacement near Tommy, Foster, started breathing too fast, eyes wide. "They know," he whispered. "They know we're done." Tommy grabbed his sleeve. "Don't listen." But doubt spread faster than fear. Men hesitated. A squad stalled in the open, and the machine guns cut them down without mercy. Lieutenant Carter crawled into Mercer's position, his face streaked with mud and blood. "They're jamming our radios," Carter said, "and that speaker's killing morale. We don't take it out. We don't move an inch." Mercer nodded once. "Then we take it out." "I need volunteers." No one moved at first. Then Tommy did. "I'll go," he said, the words out before he could stop them. Mercer stared at him. "Kansas." "I can crawl," Tommy said. "I'm small, and I'm real tired of listening to that son of a bitch tell me I'm dead." Another man joined him, then another. They moved low, inch by inch, mud soaking through their uniforms, bullets snapping overhead like angry insects. The loudspeaker grew louder, closer. The voice rose in urgency now, sharper, almost pleading. "Your families will never know where you fell," it said. "Your country will forget you." Tommy's jaw clenched. He thought of his mother folding laundry, Eddie laughing on the beach. All the names already gone. A flare burst overhead, bathing the field in white light. "Move!" Mercer roared. They ran. The German position erupted in chaos, shouting, muzzle flashes, the sudden shock of Americans appearing where none were supposed to be. Tommy fired until his rifle clicked empty, then grabbed a grenade from his belt and hurled it toward the truck. The explosion swallowed the loudspeaker in flame and twisted metal. For a moment, there was silence. Then American artillery answered. Shells screamed in from behind the lines, smashing into German trenches, tearing apart earthworks that had taken months to build. The enemy's confidence cracked. Their shouts turned panicked. Men who'd been told they were invincible broke and ran. Mercer charged past Tommy, firing from the hip, yelling like a man possessed. "Move up! Now!" The crossroads fell in less than an hour. When it was over, the field was a graveyard. Tommy sat with his back against the ruined truck, hands shaking uncontrollably. His ears rang. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, some of it his, most of it not. Foster lay nearby, a medic kneeling over him, shaking his head slowly. Tommy looked away. That afternoon, the Germans tried one last broadcast. A portable radio captured from the truck crackled weakly to life. Hitler's voice poured out, furious now, stripped of its calm certainty. He ranted about betrayal, about destiny, about sacrifice without end. The men listened in silence. Then Mercer reached down and smashed the radio with the butt of his rifle. "That's enough," he said. No one disagreed. Miles away, Allied planes bombed Berlin. Leaflets fluttered down like snow, showing real damage, real numbers, real defeat. The myth of total control was cracking everywhere at once. In a cellar in occupied Paris, Elise listened to the BBC through static. "The German advance has been halted," the announcer said. "Allied forces continue to push east." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Tommy wrote a letter that night by lantern light. "Dear Mum, I don't know if you hear what they say about us over there. Don't believe it. We're still here. I'm still here. He paused, hand trembling, then folded the paper carefully. Outside, the guns were quieter now, not silent, but changed, the sound of a tide turning. Tommy stared into the dark, exhausted beyond words, knowing the worst lie of all, that the enemy was unbeatable, had finally died on that muddy road. But the war wasn't over, and tomorrow would demand more. The war ended for Tommy Hale on a quiet morning that didn't feel like it deserved the word end. There was no trumpet blast, no sudden silence, just a grey sky over Germany, low and heavy, and a road lined with burned-out vehicles that no one bothered to move anymore. The guns had stopped 2 days earlier, but the men still flinched at sharp noises. Habit was a hard thing to kill. Tommy stood with the rest of the platoon near a small town whose name he couldn't pronounce and would never forget. A white sheet hung from a church window, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Somewhere inside, a German officer was signing papers that made the fighting finally, officially, useless. Mercer leaned beside him, looking older than he had a week ago. Everyone did. Hell of a thing, Mercer said quietly. All that noise, all those words, and this is how it ends. Tommy nodded. He thought of the voices that had filled the air for years. Hitler's thunder, the promises, the threats, the certainty that history itself had already chosen sides. Now the loudspeakers were silent. The banners were gone. The myth had burned out, leaving only rubble and men who had believed too much. A group of German soldiers marched past under guard. They didn't look like monsters. They looked tired, confused. Some stared at the ground. Others looked straight ahead, like they were still waiting for someone to tell them what to think. One of them caught Tommy's eye. Just for a second. There was no hatred there, just emptiness. Back in the States, Clara Hale heard the news on the radio while standing at that same kitchen sink. "Germany has surrendered," the announcer said, his voice thick with emotion. "The war in Europe is over." Clara sat down hard at the table. Her hands shook. She laughed once, a sound halfway to a sob, and then she cried. Deep, racking sobs that came from a place she hadn't let herself touch in years. She thought of the lies she'd heard, the fear she'd carried, the nights she'd lain awake imagining her son alone in the dark. She pressed her hand over her mouth and whispered, "Come home, Tommy. Please come home." The first thing Tommy did after the surrender was sleep. Not the shallow, half-alert sleep of foxholes and barns, but the kind that pulled him under like deep water. When he woke, the world felt strange, too still, too open. The war had been a constant roar for so long that silence felt suspicious. They buried the dead properly now. Crosses marked the ground in neat lines, names when they had them, numbers when they didn't. Tommy stood at Eddie Ramirez's grave, helmet under his arm, the Kansas wind replaced by a soft European breeze. "I made it," Tommy said softly. "You should have too." Mercer stood a few steps back, giving him space. When they walked away, Mercer stopped and looked out over the field of white markers. "People back home are gonna want stories," Mercer said. "Big ones, clean ones." Tommy nodded. "What'll you tell 'em?" Mercer thought about it. "I'll tell 'em we fought men, not monsters, and that words can be as dangerous as bullets." Weeks later, as units prepared to ship home, an intelligence officer gathered them for one final briefing. Not about combat, about what they'd found. Films, documents, camps. The room was quiet as the officer spoke about how propaganda hadn't just fueled war. It had made atrocities possible, how repeating a lie long enough had turned neighbors into enemies, cruelty into duty. Tommy felt sick. He thought of the posters, the speeches, The voices that promised greatness while building graves. Afterward, he stepped outside into the sunlight and breathed like he was learning how again. The ship ride home was nothing like the one that had brought him over. Men laughed now, talked about cars and baseball and girls they barely remembered how to talk to. The Atlantic was still black at night, still endless, but it no longer felt like a grave waiting to happen. Someone turned on a radio. This time, it was American music. A swing tune that made a few guys dance badly on the deck. No speeches, no threats, just noise meant to make people feel alive. Tommy smiled, small but real. When he finally stepped off the train in Kansas, the platform was crowded. Flags waved. A band played something loud and cheerful. And there, right in front, hands clasped tight, was his mother. Clara saw him first. She didn't scream or cry. She just walked forward and held him like she was afraid he might vanish. "I'm here," Tommy whispered. "I'm really here." She nodded against his shoulder. I know. Years later, long after uniforms were packed away and the world had moved on, Tommy would sometimes wake in the night, the echo of a voice in his head, confident, cruel, promising certainty. But he'd remember the crossroads, the broken loudspeaker, the moment when words finally failed, and he'd remind himself that lies only win if no one stands up and says no. The war had been fought with guns and tanks and blood, but it had also been fought with truth, and that, Tommy knew, was the part that could never be allowed to end.